All this time, Cooper's story kept increasing in size and scope. Now he was a former intelligence briefer, which incidentally, in 1990, I did an extensive research and expose on Cooper, which is one of the reasons that we're sitting here today talking about. And I found out that if Cooper had been part of anything having to do with the briefing team, it was in the audio-visual section of it, which meant, in essence, that what he did was carry out the full ashtrays and carry in the pots of coffee. But be that as it may, later, I was to talk to a number of people about Cooper's background. One of the people that I interviewed was former Las Vegas Bullet reporter Mr. Tony Pelham. And I interviewed Pelham about Cooper and his story. And this is what Pelham had to say.
On Cooper's second trip up there a couple of years ago to Lear's house. And as you know, you might not know,
You were a reporter for the Las Vegas Bullet.
Tabloid, right. And I saw John doing these lectures. And I said, wait a minute, John, he's a wealthy, intelligent guy. So I went up and introduced myself and said, John, I want to write about this. But I said, either I'm going to write that you're a kook, or I want to retrace everything you've done so I'll understand about the little graves and the underground bases and all that. So I started reading and tracing down leads and got involved with Linda Howell and people later Towers. And so one morning John called me and said, hey, I got a guy from the Navy up here. I want you to come up here right away. I went up, introduced himself as Cooper. He talked for about 2 hours and explained his whole story from 1972 when he saw these documents, the briefing team, and so forth. So I went back and I tried to absorb this, and then I started talking with Cooper on the phone. And he gave us this name of Bob Swan. And Lear had been over to Hawaii since then, and he wasn't able to get a hold of this Bob Swan, but he said he was a building contractor over there. I kept calling until I finally got Bob Swan on the phone. And I introduced myself, and Swan concurred. Yeah, because I was still Cooper's closest friend in 72. It was the night of the eve of the wedding. Bill Cooper came to me and said, hey, I've got these documents.
Now, let me ask you a question, Tony. When was this that you spoke to Bob Swan? Do you remember the ballpark date? Because I have a reason for asking this. Because
you've seen Linda Howell's book, The Alien Harvest.
Oh, Linda and I, see, I'm a mutilation researcher myself.
Okay, well, what I was going to say was, it was, as soon as I got a hold of him, it was that following, and I told Linda, and I gave her his phone number, she got a hold of him, and then that letter that Swan sent her, whatever that date is, it would have been about 2 to 3 months prior to that when I talked to him.
So we're talking roughly September, October 1988.
Right. So that's when I talked to Swan. Swan, I was impressed. He was legit. He says, yeah, and he seemed to be a very successful building contractor over there. And he goes from island to island. And so I said, did you know? Yeah, he says, but Bill came to me with these documents. He said he had these documents. He was talking about the astronauts and the UFOs and that. He says, I can tell you up front, he says, I never accepted these documents. He says, first of all, he says, if Bill had some top secret stuff, he said, as a civilian, I didn't want to have anything to do with, he says, because that's against the law, and he says, I figured our government knew what they were doing. But he said, yeah. The only thing he would talk about was, yeah, John said it was talking about there was a base on the other side of the moon and that our astronauts had been followed by UFOs. That was the extent of it. There was none of this Kennedy stuff or any of that stuff. So I said, what did you do? He said, listen, I didn't get any documents. He said, John, Bill never gave me his documents. He said he had some papers there, but he says, I don't even know that I actually looked at them. He said, I just didn't want to be involved. He says, but Bill did seem to be very concerned about the whole thing.
Now, wait a minute now, Tony. Let me make sure I get this straight, okay? I want to get this absolutely correct. Bob Swan told you that the only thing he recalled was that Cooper had mentioned something about UFOs following the astronauts up to the moon, and allegedly there was an alien base on the dark side of the moon.
That was the extent of it. No, and I talked to him for about a half an hour on the phone. He says, up front, well, listen, he says, even though Bill's been out of the Navy all these years, he says, I don't even know if I should be talking about it. He says, because could he still get in a lot of trouble about this? I said, well, no, because Bill Cooper is advertising and trying to tell the world all this stuff, but we're trying to verify if he's a phony or if any of this stuff actually happened. But so then when I put him in touch with him and Linda Howell and such, he wrote her this letter that she published in her book. If you read the book very carefully, it doesn't really say any more than what I've said.
No, I as a matter of fact, not only have I read the book, I reviewed the book for UFO Magazine.
Okay, well then you see that still we've seen no documents. Then when I started spending my time with Bill Cooper, and mind you, the reason I maintain the relationship the way I do, and it took me as long as George Knapp asked me a long time ago to do that interview, and I finally reluctantly did it. I'm not a ufologist. I'm not in any different segment or faction of this thing. I'm a curious person, so I maintained a relationship with Bill Cooper when he put into talking about Fatima, and when this Galileo was launched, and they're going to shoot plutonium to them. I go along with all this. I never looked at Bill Cooper and said, Bill, you're full of shit, or I don't believe this. I keep the lines of communication open,
right,
so people will tell me as much as they'll tell me. So when he insisted about the documents, I said, well, Bill, I said, as a reporter, I want to verify all this. He says, well, great. He says, this is what I've been looking for, a reporter, somebody that can verify my background. He gave me that resume of those 6 previous employers. I called all 6 of them up, and I could only verify like 2 of them, and it was like, some little training school or something, like where people go to. In other words, it wasn't like he's the president of some university in California or something. I mean, the people did remember him. After I told him I had checked with a couple of schools, he says, oh, by the way, he says, I was never really fired from any job because of my UFO involvement. He says, but after I did quit, my boss says, Bill, I really wish you hadn't gotten involved in the UFO stuff. But prior to that, he would say, I've been fired and threatened.
Well, he came out publicly in 1988, and I have this on record from the Paranet Computer Informational System, which I happen to be a part of, Tony, and he was claiming that he was fired and lost a $75,000 a year job because of his UFO disclosures.
That was a lie, because after I checked out that resume, and he knew I was going to the trouble to check these things out, he called me and he says, oh, Tony, because apparently one of these previous employers had mentioned that I was checking all this out. He says, I never was actually fired. He says, he said, I would have been. He says, my employer told me after I resigned, he says, Bill, gosh, I just really wish you hadn't got involved in all this UFO stuff. You would have made a great team or something like that. So when I hit the point about the documents, I said, okay, Bill, I said, explain to me. I said, I was in the Marine Corps, and I had security clearance, and I guarded Taylor's pistols a little bit, and I was at Pearl Harbor, and I know a little bit about these things. I said, tell me this facility you worked in. Well, it was an office complex there at Pearl Harbor, and he worked the graveyard shift, him and another lieutenant. He was a chief petty officer, E6 or something. He said, but I was with a lieutenant. He worked the graveyard shift. He said, what I did after we did this briefing, and I saw all these documents and everything, I would wait until the lieutenant would go to lunch on his break, then I would go over to the file cabinet, open the file cabinet, and I said, this wasn't in a vault, it wasn't under lock and key or anything, you simply open the file cabinet. Right. Open the file cabinet, I would walk over to the Xerox machine, make Xerox copies of all the stuff, and I did this consistently on the night shift, and then I would take it out in my lunch pail or whatever. So then, he had this stuff. I said, okay, great, this is extremely high top, above top secret stuff. Now you stashed it in a secret place, and you want to make sure that you don't ever lose it, so you give Bob Swan some copies, and surely you ran off some other copies and you stashed them off at Grandma's house in Louisiana or someplace. You put them in safe places. Well, I'd rather not talk about that, okay? All right, the set that you had, Bill, you've got them somewhere. I need to know, because if you're telling the world about it, when are you going to show it to me? He says, that's the problem. I was living, I believe it was Anaheim, he was living there in L.A., and he says, we had a storage garage attached from the house. And he says, in the middle of one night, there was a mysterious fire, and it burned completely to the ground. I said, great, no problem. So the documents were destroyed. I said, now, Bill, I said, this is great. As a reporter, just simply gives me the address. I'll check with the fire chief. No, I'm not. Too many people have been threatened. Too many people have been hurt. I'm not getting anyone else involved. I said, whoa, wait a minute, Bill. I'm simply going to check a date and an address to verify that there was a fire at that address. In storage. No, I don't want to. I'm not going to do it, Tony.
There went the problem. When someone tried to verify this extraordinary story, when someone tried to sit down and figure out what was really going on, suddenly Cooper would clam up. And it was great because it was, in a way, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Later on, of course, as more and more people began to try to check up on this extraordinary story, find out, is this guy for real or not? Suddenly, here we were, all agents of the secret government, trying to destroy Bill Cooper, who was trying to bring the truth to the American people, while he was wrapped up in the American flag and the Constitution of the United States. A lot more going on at that period of time. There were conflict and confusion over the MJ-12 documents, conflict and confusion over the John Lear paper, and of course that extraordinary story brought to us by George Knapp, investigative reporter from KLAS Channel 8 in Las Vegas, on that mysterious and enigmatic guy, Robert Lazar. Now, in November of 1989, Lazar went on the second series of specials where Knapp was talking about, among other things, Area 51, and Lazar went on using his own face, his own name, and told an extraordinary story about having been hired by EG&G in Las Vegas, which was a government contractor, flown out to Area 51, then bused to an even more secret site called Area S4, where Lazar claimed that he worked on recovered alien technology. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, a flying saucer. Now, this story reverberated literally all across the globe. KLAS received calls from people all across the entire planet wanting to get their hands on a copy of that story. Now, Billy Goodman, radio host for KVEG, was able to secure Lazar to come on his program along with his buddy Gene Huff, where Lazar once again talked about his story. And when Goodman threw open the lines, he started to receive a ton of phone calls. And sooner than later, sure enough, one call came in from Mr. William Bill Cooper, who told the world, hey, I checked this guy out through my intelligence sources, and he's the real McCoy. Go why have me tell you about it. Hang on just a second, and I'll have Cooper tell you about it.
How are you feeling tonight?
Well, I'm feeling a little better. You can hear my voice still isn't right yet. I apologize to your listeners.
Well, just don't get too close to the telephone.
Oh, I'm breathing it right through the line. I just want to make a few comments, Billy. I really don't have any questions, but it pertains, and I'd like to clear up a couple of misunderstandings here. Number one, I'd like to really thank Bob Lazar for coming forward. I have been talking to him over the last year, along with John Lear. We met in groups and privately, and the man has a wealth of information. I am tickled pink that he finally decided to come forward and use his real name because it helps all of us. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart, Bob.
Oh, thanks, Bill.
Number two is that Bob is giving the impression on the air that he's doing this for selfish reasons, and I know better than that. I know that when when I first spoke to him, he was really incensed and enraged that this technology was in our hands and was not being made available to the people, and that there was countless billions of dollars being spent in the normal sector that didn't know anything about this technology to try to develop the technology and come across with a unified field theory and all of these other things, and it was being wasted when it could be devoted to other things that might help humanity and might really help the human race.
Right, I still do feel that way, Bill.
I know you do, and I want the listeners to know that because it's coming across like you're doing this just to protect yourself.
Well, I'm thinking more in the current frame of time.
I understand that, but they don't.